you don't forget, even when you convince yourself you should. A first kiss is one of them, not because it's perfect, not because it's cinematic, but because something subtle shifts in the way a man experiences the woman in front of him in that exact second, and he doesn't always have language for it afterward. Before we go any further, if you find yourself drawn to understanding these quiet psychological dynamics between men and women, you might want to stay close to this space. A small like or subscription isn't about numbers, it's just a way of saying, this is something I want to keep exploring. All right, let's continue. Now listen, I want you to imagine this from his side for a moment. He's not analysing you. He's not thinking in strategy or logic. Most men aren't in that moment. What's happening is far more instinctive, almost disarming. There's anticipation, yes, but also hesitation. A kind of internal negotiation he doesn't voice. Is this the right moment? Will she pull away? Am I misreading everything? And then it happens. That first kiss. What surprises most men isn't the kiss itself, it's what they feel right after. The emotional aftershock. The way time seems to slow for a fraction of a second, like his nervous system is trying to record every detail at once. The warmth, the pace, the hesitation, or the lack of it. But here's what most people misunderstand. It's not about technique. It's about presence. When a woman is fully there, not performing, not overthinking, not trying to manage how she's being perceived, there's a kind of emotional clarity that registers on a deeper level than words. It doesn't create instant obsession, but it does create memory intensity. And memory intensity is what lingers. He might walk away acting normal, even casual, but something has been marked internally. Not in a dramatic way, more like a quiet reference point his mind returns to without permission. And this is where it gets psychologically interesting. Men often don't immediately process emotional significance. They feel it first and understand it later, sometimes much later, in silence, when the moment replays without distraction. That's when meaning starts forming. And if there was something authentic in that exchange, something unforced, something emotionally real, it doesn't fade the way surface-level interactions do. It stays. Not as obsession, not as fantasy, but as a lingering imprint that subtly changes how he interprets you in his mind afterward. And most women never see that part happening. What happens after that moment is where most people completely misunderstand male psychology. Because the kiss itself is not the peak experience, it's the echo that follows it. He might not text right away, or he might text too quickly and then act slightly different afterward. A little more reflective, a little less certain in his usual rhythm. And if you're the woman in this story, you might start filling in the silence with assumptions. Did I do something wrong? Was it not good? Did I misread him? But what's actually happening is far less direct. His mind is trying to categorize something that didn't fit neatly into his usual emotional filing system. See, many men move through dating with a kind of internal structure. They sort experiences quickly: interested, not interested, serious, casual, keep, release. It's not always conscious, it's efficiency, emotional processing under constraint. But then there are moments that don't file properly, a kiss that feels different, not because it was better, but because it carried emotional weight without explanation. And that creates a delay in understanding. He might replay it later when he's alone, not in a romanticized way at first, more like analysis without realizing it. His mind returns to the texture of it, the timing, the feeling of whether it was mutual, whether it was real, whether it surprised him more than he expected. And here's something most people never consider. Men often feel safest when they can predict their emotional environment. So when something unpredictable feels good, it creates a strange internal contradiction. Comfort and uncertainty at the same time. And that combination is what makes an experience memorable, not intensity alone, but emotional contrast. Now let's be careful here, because this is where people get it wrong online. This isn't about making someone obsessed. That's not how human psychology works in any healthy or stable sense. What actually happens is much more subtle. Emotional imprinting through presence, timing, and authenticity. If a moment feels real, the brain doesn't discard it easily. It revisits it, especially when there's distance afterward. But distance matters too. Too much chasing afterward, too much explaining, too much emotional overexposure. It actually dilutes the imprint. Not because interest disappears, but because clarity replaces mystery, and clarity changes emotional texture. What stays strongest in memory is often what was felt deeply but not fully resolved. That's why some men seem to come back mentally to certain women, even when they've moved on socially. It's not confusion, it's incomplete emotional processing. And if you've ever been on the other side of that silence, wondering what changed after something felt meaningful, you're not imagining the depth of it. You're just not seeing how slowly the mind sometimes integrates emotion. And that delay is where everything begins to quietly shift. There's a point after the silence where something interesting can happen, and most people misread it completely. It's not that he suddenly becomes obsessed. That word gets thrown around too easily. It makes everything sound louder than it really is. What actually happens is quieter, more internal, less dramatic. He starts noticing comparisons, not intentional ones, not the kind he sets out to make. But the mind does this automatically when something leaves an emotional trace. He might be in completely unrelated situations, talking to someone else, going about his day, and suddenly there's a faint recall of that moment. Not the person in full detail, but the feeling, the emotional temperature of it. And here's what makes it stick: inconsistency. If everything in his life feels predictable, emotionally flat, or socially repetitive, then one moment that carried real presence stands out more than it should. Not because it was engineered, but because it was alive. That's the part people miss. It was never about doing the right thing in a calculated sense. It was about whether, in that moment, there was emotional honesty between two people, even if it was brief, even if nothing was said afterward. Now, from the outside, you might think the story is about him. But psychologically, it's also about what you believe happened. Because memory isn't fixed. It shifts depending on how you interpret it afterward. If you replay the moment with anxiety, questioning your behavior, over-editing your presence in your mind, you start changing your own emotional imprint of it. And that's important. Because the way you remember yourself in those moments affects how you show up later. Not in a performative way, but in confidence, in ease, in whether you trust your own instincts or second-guess them into silence. There's a subtle difference between someone who tries to be memorable and someone who is simply fully present. One creates tension, the other creates clarity. And ironically, clarity is what tends to linger longer. But let's go deeper for a moment. Men don't just remember moments, they remember emotional versions of themselves in those moments. How they felt around you, whether they felt calm, uncertain, grounded, or slightly exposed in a way they don't usually experience in everyday interactions. That emotional self-image becomes part of the memory too. So when they revisit it later, it's not just you they're thinking about, it's who they became when they were with you. And that can be powerful. Not in a controlling sense, not in a way that guarantees outcomes, but in a human sense. A recognition that certain interactions leave behind emotional residue on both sides. And once you understand that, you stop thinking in terms of chasing reactions and start noticing the quality of presence you bring into moments that don't announce themselves as important until much later. Now, here's where the story often gets misunderstood again, especially in the way people talk about attraction online. They make it sound like there's a switch that flips, like one kiss changes everything permanently. But real human psychology doesn't work in switches. It works in layering. If something meaningful happened between two people, it doesn't erase uncertainty. It creates it. Because now there's a reference point, and reference points change behavior quietly. He might find himself thinking, why did that feel different with her? Not in a dramatic, spiraling way, but in small pauses during ordinary life. Waiting in line, driving, waking up in the middle of the night for no reason he can immediately explain. It's not obsession, it's processing. But here's the part most people never consider. What he's actually trying to understand isn't just the kiss. It's how he felt about himself in that moment. There's a kind of emotional mirror effect that happens during intimate connection. You don't just register the other person, you register who you become in their presence. Whether you feel confident, hesitant, grounded, or strangely open in a way you don't usually allow. And that can stay unresolved, especially if the moment ended without clarity, without a clear direction, without an emotional closing. So the mind keeps it alive a little longer than necessary, trying to resolve something that was never fully defined in words. And if there's distance afterward, the absence becomes part of the meaning. But let's be very honest here, because this is where people can misinterpret things. Distance doesn't create value by itself. Silence doesn't create attraction by itself. Those are oversimplifications. What distance does is give space for memory to breathe. If something was shallow, distance exposes it. If something had emotional weight, distance preserves it longer than expected. And that's the difference most people feel but don't articulate. Now, if you're the one thinking back on a moment like that, there's also something worth noticing about your own mind. You might be replaying it not because you want a specific outcome, but because it gave you a rare feeling of being fully seen or fully present without performing. That's rarer than most people admit. And when you experience it, even briefly, your mind tags it as significant. Not because it's trying to create attachment, but because it recognizes emotional clarity as something worth remembering. Still, memory can distort if you overfeed it. Replaying a moment too many times can slowly replace what actually happened with what you wish it meant. And that's where confusion starts to grow on both sides. So the real question is never, how do I make someone think about me? It's something far more grounded. What kind of emotional impact am I leaving when I show up as myself? Because that is what actually lingers. At some point, if you've been holding on to a moment like this, you start realizing something slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't the kiss that changed everything, it was what the kiss revealed. About presence, about attention, about how rare it feels when someone is fully there with you, without trying to manage the moment, without performing a version of themselves they think will be accepted more easily. And that realization can stay with a man longer than he admits out loud. But not in the way movies describe it. Not as sudden longing or dramatic pursuit. More like a quiet recalibration. He starts noticing how many interactions feel automatic after that. How many conversations don't carry that same subtle depth. And sometimes, without even meaning to, he compares, not people, but states of connection. That's the key difference. It's not about replacing you in his mind. It's about recognizing a certain emotional texture he doesn't encounter often. And yes, sometimes he circles back. Sometimes he reaches out again. Sometimes he doesn't. But here's what matters most, and I want you to really hear this clearly. What lasts is never the attempt to be unforgettable. What lasts is how real you were in the moment you didn't think mattered yet. There's a strange pressure people carry in dating now. Like every interaction has to lead somewhere. Like every kiss has to mean something permanent. Like every emotional spark has to turn into a storyline that continues. But real connection doesn't always behave that way. Sometimes it appears briefly, leaves an imprint, and then dissolves back into life, changing both people in ways they don't fully understand until much later. And that's not failure, that's experience. If you're the one replaying these moments, wondering what they meant, wondering what shifted afterward, it might help to step back from trying to decode it like a puzzle, because not everything emotional is meant to be solved. Some things are meant to be recognized, experienced, then released without turning it into a story that traps you in repetition. And if there's one quiet truth underneath all of this, it's this. People don't become emotionally attached to perfect moments. They remember real ones, even imperfect, even brief, even unresolved. So instead of asking how to make a moment create a reaction, the deeper reflection is simpler and a lot more honest. Can you stay fully present in the moments that matter without needing to control what they turn into afterward? Because that's where real impact comes from. Not intensity, not strategy, but presence that doesn't disappear the second the moment is over.